Hi, everybody. My name is Satya Mamdani, and I am a member of the Article 2 Study Commission. I'm 17 years old, and I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota. And I will be your host for this mini interview series that the Article 2 Study Commission is going to be putting out. The series is going to address a variety of topics that relate to the Commission's charge and the work that the Commission is doing. And they will come out monthly. So be sure to check back on our website to see those monthly interviews. They're not going to be super long, so I'd really encourage you to take a listen, maybe even just have it on in the background while you're doing something else. I'm super excited to welcome our first guest. She has been a leader in the 8th Principle Project and is also a member of our commission. Please welcome Paula Cole Jones.
Hi, Satya. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good.
So I'm super excited to have Paula here because if you haven't picked up on it yet, our first topic is going to be the 8th Principle Project. And before we get into it and my questions that I have for Paula, I'm going to go ahead and read to you the wording of the proposed 8th Principle. Goes, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And really quick, before we get into my questions for Paula, if you have any questions after this interview on the 8th Principle, feel free to go to 8thprincipleuu.org. Has a really wonderful background section that can answer a lot of questions that people may have on background if they aren't addressed here. So to get started, I wanted to do a quick background on what the 8th Principle is for those out there who don't know. So Paula, could you maybe tell us what the 8th Principle is? What are we talking about here?
Yes. So the 8th Principle is a proposal that some congregations have actually adopted. So it's more than a proposal there. But it's a proposal for Unitarian Universalists to center our work around building inclusion into our spiritual life, into our congregational life, into our practices. And this is inclusion across the board in terms of Black, Indigenous, people of color, inclusion in terms of gender and age and ableism and sexual orientation, and just all of the ways that we are actively engaged in recognizing our full humanity for each of us. It's implied in the 7 principles, but our work is, we treat it more like social justice. And this is to move it from that social justice arena and make it central in terms of spiritual development and our wholeness as human beings. And that's what the 8th Principle is intended to do.
So thank you. That was a wonderful overview of what it's intended to do. I was wondering how and why did it get started? How did the project begin and why?
Yes. So the 8th Principle also, it comes out of years of work in Unitarian Universalism. I think each generation inherits the work that's been done before. So there's a certain amount of legacy, and each generation has a new starting point, right? I grew up Unitarian Universalist in a diverse congregation. And it wasn't until I started getting involved in leadership in 1998, 1999, and started going to General Assembly and visiting other congregations, and realized that the experience I had growing up was not really the norm, the average experience in terms of diversity. So I had a particular lens that was always activated, because I was asking myself, well, why not? Why not? And I got quite involved in our anti-racism work by 1999 on the national level. And I traveled a lot. You know, I worked with a lot of congregations, and that question was just always there in the back of my mind. Why not? Why is it that we struggle so much? We've got these wonderful principles. They truly are universal. They speak to a lot of people. And I just was constantly trying to figure out, well, why have we struggled so much around the work of, in particular, racial justice and inclusion? Um, and so I had conversations with ministers, with lay people. I mean, this really was years of inquiry. But I remember the point at which it started to get resolved for me. And I was in a congregation, I was visiting for a weekend, a congregation that is recognized as one of our multicultural congregations. And I'm just experiencing it, right? And as an outsider, you know, we're there, and yet we still are in some observant mode. But I remember the moment, it was during the Sunday worship service, and I was putting my whole weekend together, and it's like, I got it. We can all embrace the 7 principles, and yet only go so far in terms of multiculturalism, because our principles rarely get tested around race, right? So the lack of naming it, right? That we can all assume, and certainly it's implied in every principle, but that's interpreted through each individual's experience. There's nothing that's central in our principles as a collective calling for us to make this part of our spiritual journey, right? The work of dismantling oppression, the work of dismantling racism is spiritual work. It's sacred work, because it's like, how do we acknowledge and recognize the spark of the divine in each person if oppression is allowed to stand? And the whole, one of the purposes of oppression is to create this, like this social order, right? This valuing and devaluing. And that's our work to undo that. So we are building equity and inclusion into our thinking, into our services, into our relationships. And so the 8th principle is really the why around it, was because there is nothing in our purpose, in our principles, that call us to do that. It's implied. So if I individually am oriented that way, then, and I am, then everything that I do is done from a perspective of inclusion. But for people who are not oriented that way, the work of inclusion may be something else. Not to say it doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean that it's central. And this is work around identity, not just individual identity, but the identity of our congregation. So the 8th principle, it became apparent to me, Satya, that it was missing the language, our principles are missing the language that would hold us all, or would help us all to center this as part of our spiritual work. Let me say just another piece about that. So I highly value the principles, but also in my travel, and I have an environmental background, my professional work, before I got fully involved in Unitarian Universalism. For me, this inclusion resided in the 7th principle, for the respect for the interconnected web of life of which we all are a part. That said it all to me. And so it was painful to come to the realization over and over again that the seventh principle gets interpreted frequently, if not most often, as the environment. And for me, the interconnected web of life of which we all are a part, that took care of the multicultural piece. But I go back to what I said about our principles are interpreted through individual lenses. That was my interpretation. I came to learn that that is not the way that other people interpret it. And so it was hard for me to see where our principles really called us to do that work. And the eighth principle then grows out of ongoing anti-racism work, where the community that we had been building in what was the Joseph Priestley district and now is the Central East region. We have been doing our work consistently for years, and the conversation then around the eighth principle really evolves from figuring out how do we interpret this work that we're doing for the average Unitarian Universalist.
That was a wonderful response. I think for me personally, really attached with what you were saying about legacy and how each generation inherits a different legacy, given that I am a part of the youth of Unitarian Universalism at this point in time. And how I think that it's so amazing that part of the legacy that I'm inheriting is the work that you have been doing with the eighth principle over the years, and also that idea of having equality and inclusion in our thinking and having that kind of be embedded into the thoughts and stuff that we are coming up with. And I really loved that piece of what you just said. That part really touched me.
So thanks for picking that up, Satya. For me, the diverse, multicultural, beloved community was legacy that as a youth, as a young person in Sunday school in my church, a diverse church, so it was just a given. I saw it every Sunday. And it was later that I had to really ask, well, why is this not more present in other locations? So I get excited about the eighth principle because for congregations that are adopting it now, the young people there will not be questioning it. It will be second nature. It'll be norm. It's almost like if you look generationally at technology, look, when I was in school, we were still taught Greg's shorthand. Oh my goodness, which, it's like, what is that, right?
I don't know what that is.
We had to take a semester of typing, which was good for the computer. But I mean, for young people now, you see babies, 2 years old, 1 year old with technology in their hands. And the eighth principle would be like that as well. Our babies, our children will have inclusion as a way of life and not as something to be debated about. So I get excited about the prospect of the eighth principle.
I love that metaphor. That was such an amazing metaphor for comparison. But I also get really excited about seeing the eighth principle and inclusion being worked into what we're teaching our youth, because I teach religious education at my church on Sundays, and it makes me so happy to see the curriculum that we're putting out for that Sunday different than what I grew up with, but focusing on inclusion, focusing on equality, and seeing the kids get really excited about it, but also seeing them just be used to it. to just have it be normal for them to be like, oh, well, of course everyone's included. I had a little boy last Sunday, a couple Sundays ago maybe, who we were talking about inclusion. He was like, well, boys and girls can always hold hands. Like, they can always be friends. Why shouldn't they be friends? They should always be friends. There's nothing in the way of that. And I was like, I love that. I love that this is what we're teaching our youth and our children, our babies, putting the technology right into their hands. And they're used to it. They're good with it. They've got it. So I really
It's natural.
it's natural for them, which is such a beautiful thing to see. What I should really get to, though, is how does the work of the eighth principle intersect with the work of the Article 2 Study Commission? And how have you seen your work kind of intersect with our discussions and what the work we've been doing so far on the commission?
Yeah, so that's an important question. And this is a good time for me to say that Bruce Pollock Johnson is my co-leader in this work around the eighth principle. He and I have been working together for a long time. He's out of the Philadelphia area, out of Church of the Restoration. And so we're collaborators around this. The eighth principle was put in writing in 2013. And it happened as a result of, well, just a number of things. Let me take that back. I was going to say as a result of. I recall we were in Washington having a couple of anti-racism workshops one weekend. It was the same weekend that the verdict for George Zimmerman was issued. And I can remember how difficult it was that weekend that Zimmerman was not held responsible for the killing of Trayvon Martin. And I think it was just real clear to people that we, Unitarian Universalism, needed something that calls us more deliberately into the work. The eighth principle was already like in its early formation stages. But people were expressing a sense of disappointment of, for some, being in congregations that were inadequately speaking to the moment, even if it was like a Sunday service. And so this was very early in the Black Lives Matter movement. But that weekend just really stands out for me. And Bruce and I collaborated around the writing of the eighth principle, and we work together still around helping to build the project. So it dovetails with our work in that he and I have, of course, we've always seen this as a national piece to achieve, having it included in the Unitarian Universalist principles. So we would go from 7 to 8. We're both lay leaders. I want to say that because neither of us are trained. We haven't gone to seminary. We're not trained to be ministers. So we may have a different take on it than ministers do. And we have from the beginning seen this as twofold. One as a grassroots movement, and then two as an effort to have it embraced nationally, adopted nationally. At the General Assembly in 2017, which was held in New Orleans, Bruce and I, leading up to that General Assembly, had been working with the board, the UUA board, around how do we get the principle adopted, really. That we were very deep in that conversation for, it seems, almost a year before that General Assembly was held. And so there were a lot of deliberations. We were learning about the processes. Jim Key was still the moderator of the association at that time. And we have been in conversation with a number of people who had a lot of experience. And so we were looking at, so how do we get a certain number of congregations to endorse the eighth principles so that it would stand a better chance of being adopted, I'm sorry, Zoom at home, right? Adopted nationally. And so we were advised to ask for the Article 2 Study Commission to be activated, which happens periodically as a part of our institutional process. And it was a bit overdue, as some people had said. So at that General Assembly, we introduced a responsive resolution asking for the commission to be formed to consider the eighth principle as one of our national principles. I remember that it was quite tense. I had no idea, I don't know about Bruce, but we had no idea how it was going to go. You know, you have to sit through the discussions on the floor. And it was overwhelmingly accepted. So what the vote was not for the adoption of the principle, the vote was for the formation of the commission to consider the eighth principle. So that in part, the relationship between the eighth principle and the study commission, it's a very direct relationship. The commission was put in place, was named at our last General Assembly in 2020. And I was named to the commission. So I work with you on a regular basis. And the eighth principle is a part of our charge. So that, let me say just a little bit more about the relationship. The eighth principle kind of has a life of its own and it's growing. But in terms of the commission, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of input to receive from UUs and organizations, or our institutional organizations. So we don't know really what it's going to look like in the end, what our proposal will be. It may not show up as an eighth principle. We just don't know yet. But we do know that the essence of the eighth principle will be present in whatever it is we do. And I just want to share with people, there's many different reactions to the eighth principle as there are people. I just want to say that. So for anyone who has their personal opinion and preferences, you're right. And everyone else has their personal preferences too. But it has been said that the eighth principle should be the preamble to the principles. Oh, hey, that makes sense, doesn't it? It's been said that the eighth principle is the principle, the only one that we need, and so wherever people stand on it, I think that the board early on, when we were in those periods of deliberation, was really looking at how it could be infused in everything or in all of the pieces around Article 2. So there is not an answer at this point, but we are certain that the eighth principle is central in influencing our discernment, and meanwhile we continue the eighth principle project as well.
Which actually leads right into my next question. Is we're addressing this on the commission, as Paula just discussed. It's a prominent part of our charge. And in whatever form we end up having it in our final proposal, we're discussing it. It's a part of what we're doing. But my question is, so there's congregations throughout Unitarian Universalism that are working on adopting the eighth principle right now. They're in those processes of adopting it for their congregations, or they're beginning that process. Should they keep going or should they stop? If we're doing all this work on the eighth principle on the national level, do they still need to be adopting it in their congregations?
Yeah, and that's a question that a number of people have asked too. It's a logical question. The answer is yes, they should keep going. So let's talk a little bit about that. We have, again, had a grassroots effort from the beginning of our work. The first congregations started adopting the eighth principle in 2017. In fact, leading up to that General Assembly, I mentioned there were two congregations that had adopted it before General Assembly. One was Bruce's congregation, UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia. The other was the First Unitarian Church in Honolulu. So two congregations had already adopted it. What's important about the grassroots movement is one, the work that would need to be done nationally anyway, if the eighth principle was to be adopted in its form, there would still need to be what would be considered a study process where congregations have time between the time it was introduced and the time that we asked to vote. Congregations would need to be engaged in a conversation about it anyway. And I look at the work that's being done now, that's happening just through our grassroots process. Also, we know the more congregations that do this work at the grassroots level, the more support there would be for a national adoption of the eighth principle. So that's one part of the answer. I think more importantly, though, is our local congregations are where most people learn about Unitarian Universalism, either through something that the congregation is doing or someone who is belongs to that congregation or is associated with that congregation in some way is that point of contact, right? So we could adopt the eighth principle nationally, but if the congregations do not adopt it, it will have very little meaning and effect. It'll be important as a national statement, but in terms of, you could say, where the rubber meets the road or where people encounter Unitarian Universalism, it won't have its effect. By the same token, if congregations adopt the eighth principle, then whether it gets adopted nationally or not, they have the eighth principle as part of their congregational life, as part of their local work, as part of their identity. So what happens locally to me is just as important, if not more so, as what would happen nationally. We just had another congregation adopted yesterday. And it's very exciting. They did excellent work leading up to it. This is our UU congregation in White Plains, New York. So far this year, we've had 4 congregations already in 2021 adopt the eighth principle. Let me name them. It's the UU Church in Princeton, New Jersey, in Nashville, Tennessee, in Yarmouth, Maine, and in White Plains, New York. This year, we're expecting to see a groundswell, really, of congregations that are adopting it. So there are many, many that are in the process. A lot of them have already set their date for when they expect the vote to take place. There's a lot of good process, good work going on inside of the congregations. as they prepare for a congregational vote. So it's, quite frankly, it's very exciting. And the eighth principle is already doing its job. I just want you to know it's still early, it's still young, but it's already doing its job.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to hear is that local grassroots work can occur simultaneously with national
Yes.
work. Like there's no reason to feel a pressure to stop or to pause on anything you're doing in your congregations. Like this can occur simultaneously, and it's very beneficial for it to occur simultaneously.
Yes, it supports what we are doing at the national level.
Yeah. So just wanted to put that out there and make sure I addressed that question. That way, any congregations out there who are having questions about that have a clear answer from our commission.
Let me also say we have a monthly an eighth principle learning community that meets monthly. So people who are interested can come and learn from those who have some experience. And you know, we recognize, we celebrate, we kind of track, we share. There have been a number of really interesting conversations, and this is a big one. In December, we had 4 ministers come together to be in conversation about what it was like to minister in a congregation that had adopted the eighth principle. This is so young, and when we think about institutional change, it doesn't happen. Well, it rarely happens overnight, let me say. And so we're at a point now where people can begin to talk about the experience. So it's almost like a bear witness, right, to this as a part of a change process. And that's available for people to hear. We have had Black, Indigenous, and people of color come together and talk about uh, why the eighth principle matters. And it's a conversation that I think a lot of people don't get to hear. It's very important. We are about to hear from youth in a couple of congregations where the religious educators are doing very innovative work around teaching the eighth principle, around teaching inclusion. And we're going to hear what some of the reflections and experiences from youth in those congregations. You know, it's so new that the stories are just beginning to emerge. I do want to share, Satya. I think that the eighth principle is going to lead to a bit of a spiritual awakening for Unitarian Universalism. I think it can revitalize the Unitarian Universalist movement because we're starting to unlock. I think about it in terms of there's a whole realm of where Unitarian Universalism can flourish, where we can flourish with Unitarian Universalist identity that we're just beginning to embrace as central to who we are. It's there, it has been central to who we are, but we haven't really fully embraced it as part of the spiritual journey. So um, it'll be interesting to see what we learn over the next couple of years. But this is going to be a very good year for the eighth principle.
Well,
I have a question for you.
oh, I'd love to answer.
Yes. So, you know, we talked about each generation has a new starting point, and there are quite a few years between you and me. But so, what does the eighth principle mean to you, Satya? And I haven't asked you this. Does it matter? Would it matter if it were not adopted? Whoa. So to have it adopted or to have it not adopted, does that really matter? Is it just something that we can pass on, or tell me what your reflection is?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that I attend First Universalist Church in Minneapolis, which is in the process of working to adopt the eighth principle on a congregational level, and that I also am a part of a BIPOC youth group at my church that meets about twice a month. Um, I think that in terms of what you were asking, if it matters, if it's adopted, I'm assuming that you're talking about adopted at a national level.
No, I'm asking at the congregational level.
I think that it's a really good question, Paula. Um, I think that for me and for my experience with the eighth principle, for it to be adopted or not to be adopted, the work that has been done around it that I've been exposed to and the attention that has been brought to the eighth principle project is what has really changed how I see an inclusive community for me. So I've been exposed to these ideas of the eighth principle and to the eighth principle project and to the idea of the beloved community, which, by the way, was not something that I was familiar with until maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. Like, this is relatively new to me, which I'm sure many of you out there, it's new to you as well. As Paul was saying, this is a new movement. This is a new project. And I think even if it does get adopted, that's awesome. I absolutely would love for it to be adopted in my church. If it doesn't, I don't think the impact is lessened, because I think that all of the work that has been done around it, all the conversations that we're having in our church or that we're planning to have in our church around it is bringing this idea into our community. And we've talked about it in my BIPOC group. And honestly, just the discussions is what's really changing it for me. I think that the act of adopting, in a lot of ways, is really the ceremony at the end of all the work, because you go through a process of discussion and talking about it and talking about how you would implement that and what changes you're looking to see in your community. And having addressed all of those changes in those discussions is where I think a lot of the work really begins, whether or not it's adopted in the end. So for me, I don't think that it matters if it's adopted or not. I think it matters that you are having the conversations around it. So I feel like if your congregation doesn't adopt it in the end, don't be disheartened, because A, you can always reintroduce it.
Right.
And B, you've had those conversations, you began that work, you have a starting block, and you can continue that work now. So I think that that's the big benefit to the eighth principle, is the conversations that it's creating and the acknowledgement that we have some problems with institutional racism and that that's something that we want to work to dismantle to create more inclusive communities. And the conversations that have been created from the eighth principle address that. And that's honestly what I'm really grateful for, is the conversations that have been created. That answer
Okay.
the question?
Yeah, it does. I also want to kind of emphasize too, which doesn't get emphasized enough. This is a proposal about building the beloved community by dismantling racism and other oppressions. We focus a lot on racism because I think, one, it's some of the hardest work to do. But also we are talking about, well, multi-generationalism. You know, it's critical that we address ageism, right, in congregations, so that young people, and especially those who are growing up in Unitarian Universalist spaces, will feel included and find space to belong, a space to continue to grow and develop, to bring your talents once you have finished the RE programs. Yeah, that's important. Our work around ageism also includes the aging population. As people age, that does not stop them from needing church. I remember as my mother was aging in her later years, and especially once she retired, she was a teacher. Once she retired, the church community became even more important for her. So we have a lot of people who are baby boomers who are aging, uh, and so the multi-generational piece, dismantling oppressions, includes um, how we treat people on both ends of the aging spectrum. Our churches, in terms of ableism, you know, who who can partake in our services and programs. I remember again when um, my mother, sitting next to her on a Sunday, and when she got to have a hymnal with large print, I remember her reaction. What is it like for a congregation to offer sign language so that the services can be experienced by people, and to have accessibility for people who have mobility issues or hearing issues? All of these things really, really matter if we're trying to build inclusion. They may be taken for granted, especially if they're already present, or if one doesn't need them, it could very easily be taken for granted. But, it's just, if we're going to build the beloved community, it'll be a community where we are actively removing barriers for people to belong, to participate, especially people who embrace the principles. So I just want to make sure that we hold that up. One of the questions that gets asked often around the eighth principle is, why do we single out racism? I think, quite frankly, nationally, that question has been answered. Let me just reiterate, if we do not dismantle racism, white supremacy will never be dismantled. And so we just need to stay at it, just keep doing our work, and to undo the historic inequities that have been built into the culture in the United States.
Yeah, I thank you so much. And I really loved what you said about multi-generational communities as being a part of the beloved community and a part of what we're creating with the beloved community. And I will add that although I only talked about racism prior, part of my experience in my church has to do with multi-generational communities is that we have an adult BIPOC group at our church and we have a youth BIPOC group at our church. And just recently, we've started having everyone have meetings together every once in a while.
Nice.
And it is the best thing that I could have ever imagined. And honestly, I didn't ever imagine it.
Yeah.
I think that youth being able to have the mentorship and talk with adults that have experienced things really similar to what I'm experiencing as a youth and hear their knowledge, know their wisdom is such a benefit. And also, like, I think it's something that isn't talked about enough, but like, you can be friends with people who are older than you. And I think for youth at 17 years old, like, it's weird sometimes to be like, oh, I really like this adult. I really like talking to this adult. But part of encouraging a multi-generational community allows those friendships and those mentorships to foster, which is really beautiful. And when you pointed that out, it just set off a light bulb in my head to bring that up.
Yeah, that's what it means to be a community, right?
It really does. Well, thank you so much, Paula, for doing this interview with me. And I think you really addressed a lot of aspects of the eighth principle. I'm super grateful that you could come on and talk with me today. And that will conclude our interview, everybody. Like I said before, if you have any questions about the eighth principle that weren't addressed, a great place to go is eighthprincipleuu.org. Has a lot of information on there about the eighth principle, as well as this interview will be on our website, and we'll include a couple other resources in the description below the video. So yeah, thank you all so much. And that concludes our interview for today. See you next month.
Thank you, Satya.